Alright, welcome back to part 2 of the Embergen Essentials crash course. In this video we're going to be looking at the building blocks of a simulation, really the emitters and how you work with them. So let's go burn some stuff. So in this video, we're really only going to be focusing on 3 or maybe 4 nodes. Most of this we don't need, so I'm just going to grab a bunch of it and shove it off to the side because we're not interested in it today. We will get to all those other nodes, of course, in other episodes and in deep dives as well, because a lot of them are really, really useful. But for today, we're just looking from the simulation node and then back up the chain. So start with the simulation node. Think of it as like the beating heart of your simulation. It's the brain that makes it all happen. And when we select our simulation node, we've got so many properties in here. And there's quite a few of these that can really, really drastically change what's going on in your simulation. But for today, we're just going to leave it as is, but we're going to have a quick look at the domain, that first tab there. So if you've ever tried to run simulations on a computer before, you're probably familiar with what a domain is, or a bounding box. And that's this cube that's visible in our viewport right here. And it's the boundary at which the computer kind of stops caring about what's going on outside of the simulation. It's not worried about what's going on outside of that box. It's the area of interest, really. Now, the reason it exists is because, Embergen's got a horizon over there. But if we tried setting up sort of 5,000 individual fire sims, it would be way too much for the computer to keep track of. You could have a really beefy GPU, but there would be a point at which the computer just can't keep up with it all. Even now, inside of that domain, there are millions and millions of voxels that are carrying more than one layer of data. So there's heat, there's density, there's motion vectors. And if this domain, this bounding box, was really, really big, the computer would just fall over it, just slow to a crawl. So that's why it's common when you're working with simulations to really limit your area of interest to something quite small as you can make it, really, to keep things performant and fast to process. Now, looking ahead and coming down the track, so Embergen 2 is going to be running things slightly differently. It's going to be operating on like a sparse solver, which is intelligently allocating where this domain is. So you don't really need to set it yourself. And the upshot of that really is more expansive, larger simulations that are quicker to process. So even though we're not really changing anything about a simulation, we've kept the simulation node because it's responsible for our domain. The settings for the domain are inside the simulation node. You can see it on that first tab there. So our current size is 128 by 256. Let's whack this up to 256 by 256. So we've got a larger domain to work in. And while we're at it, let's turn off our skybox. Now the volume emitter here, this is where we're going to start. This is like a common garden variety emitter, and it's really where you should start. It's like your basic emitter. So we can see from our node graph that we've got the volume emitter plugging into the emitters pin on the simulation node here. Let's double click these noodles. We'll disable these, and we'll notice that it automatically turns off. In fact, we'll get rid of this noise node as well, just to tidy it up. So the simulation node, it wants to simulate something. It doesn't know what to simulate. We're going to plug this volume emitter into it by pulling the pin out, popping it into here. And this volume emitter really says, like, hello, I'm an entity in 3D space. I carry this much fuel, I carry this much heat, and I carry this much smoke and density and that stuff. Simulation node says, that's great, thanks. But I don't know where you are in 3D space. So I need you to tell me where you are and what shape you are. And that's what we use this primitive shape for. So if you don't have one in your scene, you can actually just pull out from the shapes pin there, let go, and we use a primitive. And because it's primitive, like you might have seen that in lots of other 3D software, you've got a choice of all these basic shapes that you can use. I tend to use a torus, and we're going to bring it up into the center of the scene there, center of the domain. I'm just going to grab this force noise and just drag it into the volume emitter there, just to break it up a little bit. So now our simulation knows about our volume emitter. That's great. That's pushing the heat and flames and fuel into the scene, and that knows about our shape primitive, which is giving it an area in space to be active. There's a couple of notes here, so you can have more than one primitive or shape feeding into one emitter. And that's great. So you could have multiple shapes in your scene, giving off fire or smoke or fuel or whatever. And likewise, you can have more than one volume emitter. So if we copy and paste this guy, plug it into our simulation, but this one, instead of emitting fire, let's just emit some smoke. So let's say fuel rate 0, smoke rate, whack that right up, take the temperature down, and let's copy and paste our primitive, but move it around somewhere. If we put this smoke under the fire, you'll notice that the smoke's actually kind of getting pulled into the flames and being pushed up, which is quite neat. Right, so let's stop faffing around with those and let's look at the actual volume emitter in depth. So if we select the node, bring up our properties here. So the first property that you're going to notice is emitter activity. Obviously you turn it off, it's going to turn the emitter off, and this is animatable. So if you watch the first episode of this series, you'll know that by clicking on these icons over here, you can start to add keyframes, or you can pin drivers into this to turn things on and off over time. And underneath the emitter activity, you've got sort of burst controls. I don't tend to use them that much. I have other ways that I tend to get that effect. And moving on to the next section, we've got transform control. So this is a transform control for the volume emitter, not the shape that it's plugged into. Notice that if we move the volume emitter, the shape will get carried along with it. So it's like the shape feeding into it is now sort of parented to that emitter. The shape itself can move around freely, but if we then move the volume emitter, the shape gets carried with it. Mental note of this import control setting here, we're not going to mess around with that today, but we're definitely going to do a deep dive on that at some point. Then our next section is going to be emission, and this is all pretty self-explanatory. This is how much heat, how much fuel, how much smoke is being pushed into the scene via this volume emitter. So if we take our fuel rate all the way down, you would expect the fire to die out. But we're still emitting smoke, and that's because down here we've got a smoke rate. If we whack this right up, we'll get a ton of smoke into the scene. Pull this all the way down, nothing should be happening, although there is actually still heat being pushed into the scene by this emitter. So if you put these guys back to default, one thing that I found really, really interesting to play with over the last couple of years has been this emission gradient. So think of this as like a ramp that controls how tightly the emission of these things is to the shape that's feeding into it. So if we whack it all the way down to 0, it's really tightly conformed to the shape, and that's our torus. In fact, if I show the emitter and then go back to our emission gradient, if I whack this right up, you'll see that it actually comes out quite far from the shape, which can be really useful. So if you're working on an animation, you're dealing with geometry and surfaces and stuff, sometimes you want to push the simulation out ever so slightly from the surface that you're working with. Think of like a wall on fire or some petrol on a floor. And something that sometimes trips people up as well, we've got our smoke rate here. If we turn smoke emission to off, sometimes we've still got smoke, and that's because there is other smoke being generated in the scene. So although our emitter isn't pushing smoke into the scene, the fact that we have fire, fuel that's on fire, the simulation is dictating that we've got generated smoke of 15%. If we turn this off, then the fire burns but doesn't generate smoke when the fuel's expended. Back to our volume emitter. So after our emissions, we've got pressure. And pressure can be fun to play with if you are trying to set up an animation and you're like, it's not biting enough, it needs to be a bit more violent. You can add some pressure into the volume emitter. So if we gently bring this up, it's just pushing things out with a bit more force. And likewise, you can go backwards. If you go into the minus figures, it kind of pulls the fire into the shape a little bit, and you can get some nice sort of twirly motion. And when you start to work with scenes that have got some movement, so if you're animating the shapes that are feeding into emitters or colliders as well, we'll get to those as well. If you're animating these things around your scene, then you're going to want to pay attention to velocity transfer. So if we put this down to 0, as I move our torus around the scene, it shouldn't directly affect the motion of the flames. They should be fairly static. So the flames are coming off of the torus and they're going up because heat and buoyancy. But if I was to shake this left and right, it's sort of leaving the fire behind it as it goes. It's not pushing it forward, it's not pushing it back. But if we go back to our volume emitter and we play with velocity transfer, let's put it up to 200. And in theory, when I move this, the velocity, the movement of the torus should then transfer into the emitter, and it should sort of push the flames forward. So if I then move this primitive, notice how it's sort of inheriting the movement of the object. And we can go the other way with that. If we bring this down to minus 200, as I move forward, it's going to push the flames back. Might not be like instantly useful, but you might start to realize that that feature could actually be really, really useful for a particular effect or a certain thing that I'm trying to do. And at the bottom of our volume emitter page, these properties, you've got visuals, and we touched on that a little bit earlier when I enabled the view of the shape that's feeding into the volume emitter. You wouldn't always have it on, but if you are working with something that you're later going to composite footage wise, you might have something that you need to use as a cutout, for instance. So in this view, we can see that this is a torus that's on fire, especially if we go like this. But as I sort of bring this thing down, you can tell that we can see the front of this and the back. We can see through the fire, and we can see the entirety of the shape almost. If I wanted to then put this into a bit of footage and place it on top of footage, I would end up in a situation where I can see through the fire, and it just wouldn't look right. So if you were to go into your visuals and turn on show emitter, at a later point we can then use this shape as a cutout, so we wouldn't see what's behind it, but we would see the fire that's in front of it. And there are a couple of other things that you can do with this. I don't always use them, but you can have this shape or this volume emitter and the shapes that are tied into it push some light into the scene. You can't really see it doing a great deal right now, but if we had a lot of smoke in the scene, we'd be pushing light onto the surface of that smoke. So now that we're familiar with the volume emitter, like your standard emitter in Embergen, let's take everything that we know about that and then dive into the particle emitter. It does pretty much the same stuff, but it does it in a different way. Whereas in the volume emitter, we are emitting heat and fuel and smoke from the surface or the volume of this shape. In a particle emitter, if I turn this on, turn this one off, we're going to plug the same shape into it. So in this situation, rather than pushing those heat and smoke and fuel values through the shape, we're actually having the shape give birth to a load of particles. And then the fuel and the heat and the smoke is coming from the particles, which right off the bat doesn't sound too interesting, but you can have these particles do some pretty cool stuff. You notice that there's already a slight difference in that we've got this sort of fizzy looking fire down here, and this is sort of visual evidence of the fuel and the heat coming from the particles that are coming from the torus. So when we click on our particle emitter, the first thing you're going to see is this continuous emission. So if we go back to our volume emitter, we had something similar. That was emitter activity. And this does pretty much the same thing. If we untick it, it's going to stop giving birth to particles. Those particles are going to die. There's going to be no more fuel, no more heat, no more movement. So that kills that off. But it does more than just off and on. So we've got an emission rate. So we can change how many particles are born. You can really crank that up. You can have it do more than just a continuous emission. So if we turn this off, burst emission is great. So if we come out a bit, when you click burst emission, just for that one frame, it's going to birth a load of particles, but nothing after. So if we tick this, we're just going to get like a which you're probably already thinking is pretty cool for, some kind of impact effect. I'm just going to put continuous emission on here so we can see the other stuff. So it might be a little bit hard to see from here. In fact, if we change from a torus to a sphere, and I'm going to go over to this, we're going to render the particles. You should see these little white dots appearing. And I'm actually going to turn off the fire and the smoke, just so we can see what's going on with these particles. So it's still simulating. There are still flames there, there's still smoke, there's still turbulence. But all we're seeing really are the particles that are coming out of this emitter. And that's just to show you the difference between a couple of things. So currently, all these particles are coming out from the volume of the sphere. If we take this, they're coming from the boundary of the sphere. And that can sometimes really change how the rest of the fire looks once it's going. There's also this jitter distance, which is sort of how far apart the particles are from each other, how fuzzy they are when they're born. So if we ramp this up, we'll see that it starts to really fuzz out a bit. And that can be really useful because you're not just birthing particles. Every one of these particles is dropping fuel and heat into the scene. And if they're this far apart, then they're going to affect the fire in a different way than this would. So that's always a good one to play around with. Likewise, the emission styles are currently regular. It's kind of evenly spreading the birthing of these particles around. But if we change this to entangled, we get these like strands. And that can be pretty nice to work with as it is. But if we look at the fire and turn that back on, just by playing with some of the very basic properties, you can start to get some nice looking results. And this might also be a good way to show you that jitter distance. So as we start to bring up this jitter distance, you start to see that these strands, they'll sort of widen out and fuzz out a bit. And that's not just visual, that's all the fuel and the heat and the smoke is actually being dispersed over a wider area, and that affects the rest of the simulation. So I'll bring all those back to default. And there's also emission condition. That's a really fun one to play with. So currently, we're telling the emitter to always push particles out of this shape, no matter what. But we could have a masking shape. So if I turn that on, we've told it to to only birth particles if the masking shape is white. It's like a white-black map. We don't have a masking shape set up, so we're just going to pin out from this. Mask shapes, and then we're going to go with noise. And we're going to make it a bit bigger so we can really see the patches. So this is going to add some randomness to where these particles are being born on this shape. And I'm all about randomness and chaos. One of the nice things you can do with this is you can animate this noise over time. So you can have it evolve. And you can see where these hollows are. They'll change over time. If we make that quite fast. And we can make it even more apparent by making it a bit bigger. So as you watch it, it's going to change over time where everything's being born. But it goes even further. Let's get rid of the mask shape and we'll go back to a different emission condition. It's one of my favorites. It's the velocity higher then. So nothing happens. We've set below that a reference velocity of 0.3. What that's really saying is that only birth particles when this object is going faster than 0.3. Currently, it's sat still and it's not doing anything less than 0.3. So no particles. Faster than 0.3, it's going to start giving off particles, which is really, really neat. Like, I love playing with this stuff. And there's loads of creative ways that you could be using this. So if you have like an animated mesh that you've made in like 3ds Max or Blender or whatever, and you bring it in and plug it into one of these emitters, say it's a guy walking around. If he's standing still, nothing's happening. But if he starts to move, he'll start to give off smoke, start to give off fuel, heat, whatever. Now the particle emitter is actually quite an involved node, and it's a lot of fun to really, really dig into. I'll give you a really quick cursory glance at what else is in there, but we won't really cover any more of that. We'll save that for a deep dive. But you might think like, well, if this has got all of these features, why would I ever use the volume emitter? The truth is, really, there are a couple of things the particle emitter can't do, and that's just because of the presence of the particles. If you're making a looping effect, if you want to make like a 5-second long smokestack coming out of a chimney or something, if you were to do that with the particle emitter, because of the way the particles work, you'd never really be able to get the end of the animation to tie into the beginning of the animation to get a loop, whereas you can with the volume emitter. And there would probably be very little visual difference if you did it right. You know, you can make this look as good as a particle emitter. And another thing that the particle emitter can't do yet, and I'll show you that really, really quick. We go back to our volume emitter. I'll turn on show emitter so you can see the shape. We've currently got a primitive plugged into it, but if we turn that off, we're going to use a blend. And this is a special node that takes two shapes and combines them in some way. So we're going to put our sphere primitive in. Can't see anything yet because we don't have the second shape. I'm going to modify it with some noise. It's a bit hard to see here, so I'll drive up the scale a bit. So the operation we're running here is we're saying like, get the sphere, but subtract this pattern from it. And that's dictated in here, or an intersection rather. Don't click union because the whole thing will fill up with noise. You don't want that. And you can change the look of this, both the octaves and the scale, and again, the animation of it. You can have this evolve over time if you want. So I think if that's feeding into your emitter volume, you can change over time where this fire is coming from. That's pretty useful. But these shapes don't play ball with a particle emitter. You just can't plug them in. Particles really don't like that for some reason. I'm not sure what the exact reason is, but there's going to be a really good reason. So that's your two emitters. You've got your volume emitter, which does the really simple stuff, but quite often you'll be using it more than you think you would. But if you really want to play with some crazy stuff, particle emitter. And like I said, there's a bunch of stuff in it. So you've got freezing, so you can emit particles that don't act right away. They just enter into the scene, and then after a certain condition is met, maybe there's some air movement or perhaps something touches it, then those particles come to life. So you can start to dump fuel into a scene. That kind of thing. You can change how long these particles live for. So you could have them live. I mean, this one was living for what, a tiny amount of time, 0.3 seconds, but you can have them last for as long as you want, really. These particles could be alive for a very, very long time. So our initial forces are what forces, what kind of velocity these particles have when they come into the scene. It looks like these particles are going up, but it's only because they've come out of the sphere, they're being picked up by the heat and the buoyancy of the simulation, and they're being propelled upwards. We could tell, let's give them a load of speed, because currently you can see they're just sort of coming out almost to the normal of the sphere, although it doesn't really have normals, but we can push them in a direction. So here we're pushing them down, here we're pushing them up. Let's push them off on X. So push them out to the side. Now we're not pushing the fire, we're pushing the particles that are giving birth to the fire. You might already be thinking, this looks like a cool way to make a flamethrower, and there'll totally be a tutorial about how to do that. You even got control over how much these particles will actually adhere to the forces in the sim. So currently we've got this lift from the buoyancy and the heat. We can tell the particles to kind of ignore some of that. Or you can have them really, really strictly adhere to it. Or anything in between. So, particle emitter definitely deserves a proper deep dive at some point, and we'll totally get to that. But the emitters don't exist in a vacuum. They kind of rely on other things. So we've got this whole other side of things, and that's forces, and colliders we'll get to as well. But forces can really start to bring in some chaos into the scene and start to make things either seem more believable, like think about air flurries and currents and things like that. You can start to build those things up, or you can use forces to really art direct what's going on with the simulation. You know, not just rely on buoyancy and chaos and stuff. You can actually shape where the fire's going, or where the smoke's going. So I'll catch you in part 3 when we start to really dig into what we can do with forces, and it's pretty interesting stuff.